So it is time. Thank you everyone for coming, especially those of you who had to endure natural disasters on your way here. I hear that in England it is quite a nasty weather and a lot of snow. So hopefully it will be all right. We have Morgana Sythove with us tonight, and she is involved in the pagan movement, both in the Netherlands and internationally in the International Pagan Federation. And she is a rather well-known speaker for the pagan community at various interfaith forums internationally, and also a member of the IARF, member of the Dutch chapter. You may, IARF members may recall Morgana from the European conference we had in May. We have Janvi from India joining us. And today she will be talking about discrimination and the misappropriation of symbols, but in the context of the pagan or religion or religions or the indigenous people. So please try to, in your questions, your conversations, please try to remain within this topic of the pagan situation. I will mute everyone. So when Morgana is concludes her presentation, which will take probably about 20 minutes, please remember to unmute yourself before you speak. And if possible, use Zoom's raise your hand feature. It makes it much more easier for the moderators to see that you know, you want to say something. If not, then you can raise your hand on the screen, or you can just start speaking. Morgana, the floor is yours. I will spotlight you and you can share the screen if you want to. Morgana, please unmute yourself because I muted everyone, you as well, and I can't unmute you now.
So I'm now audible.
Yes.
So thank you very much for the introduction, Luke. As Luke pointed out, I was involved with the IARF conference in May 2021. And in fact, this presentation is, in a sense, has a direct relationship with the conference we had, because Luke was telling me about these particular presentations, the motivational dialogues. And of course, one of the things that came up at the conference in May also dealt with discrimination. Hang on. Sometimes these work and sometimes these don't work. I'm trying to get to the next slide. Yes, so in several talks and panels, the subject of discrimination came up on more than one occasion. In fact, we heard how one's freedom is often curtailed when there is discrimination against a person because of their religious beliefs or lifestyle. So this presentation is a bit of a link up again to those discussions we had in May, and a little bit more information about pagans, paganism, heathens, and others following a pagan tradition lifestyle. And I also include what we call people of the earth. That's another way of describing people who follow a pagan path, and many of the indigenous people. Not that I'm saying all indigenous people are pagans, far from it. Some of them have been converted to Christianity and various other, but this conversation is specifically about people who have been discriminated or are still discriminated against because of their lifestyle, which tends to be connected to the earth. So we're concentrating on people who are really involved in what we call reverence for the earth. So after May, we also had a very, very big interfaith gathering, and that was the Parliament of the World Religions. This year it was 17th to the 18th of October, and it was also online, again because of the COVID regulations and pandemic and the effects of traveling, etc., etc. Now, one of the panels which was accepted for the Parliament this year was one from Pagan Federation Scotland, and Pagan Federation International. The theme of the panel was anti-pagan discrimination, with the subtitle "The Untold Story." And one of the reasons it's the untold story is, or it should really be the forgotten story, because when Steffi Haggerty or Steffi von Scott, they organized a pagan or a survey a couple of years ago, and he was telling in this panel some of the results of that survey. But I should just mention that the survey is one of the first that we've had. Pagan Federation often does its own internal surveys, demographic surveys, of course, and where paganism in general is moving to. And of course, the Pagan Federation, which was established 50 years ago, 1971, one of its main aims has been anti-defamation work and to inform people a little bit more about what paganism is, and obviously the different pagan traditions, including heathen traditions. So at the Parliament of the World Religions, we presented this panel. It was also involved Sarah from Pagan Federation, which she was also trying to be on tonight, but apparently there's a storm in England, so unfortunately she can't join us. Because I would have liked to have her to also tell you a little bit more about the panel. And we also had Linda Haggerston, who is the Scottish Pagan Federation National Interfaith Officer, and she was also very much involved recently in the CLP26 with Interfaith Glasgow. Some of the survey results might have been quite surprising, because it was surprising how many people responded that they felt in some ways harassed or even persecuted, and had lost jobs, or felt that their pagan identity was something they couldn't always be very open about. You can see some of the survey results, and I've included the link to the recording. I'll give all the links later, don't worry, but the YouTube clip is still available, so it's perhaps nice to go and have a listen to Steffi's results and his conclusions. Now the 4 surveys, by the way, are still—
Sorry, Morgana, can you put that YouTube in the chat? Otherwise, we won't be able to get it.
Yeah. Well, I'll do that later, Vika, because
Okay.
I can't do that when I'm sharing screens. That's why I said I just noted it here so that I will be reminded to put it in the chat later. Thank you. Yeah, so the surveys are still, there are actually 4 different surveys. They are still available, so if you feel like going to have a go at answering them, please go ahead. You'll probably realize that the word pagan itself is also one of the things which we're actually having to face with. So I'm just going to talk a little bit more about the problem of the P word. Now, why I said the problem of the P word is because at the moment any of us talk about being a pagan, for some people that is also a red flag, often because they don't understand or don't know what paganism is about, or are used to what we could call a Christian definition rather than a definition of where the word actually comes from. I've just pointed out here, pagan is from the Latin paganus, which is basically of the land. Heathen is the Germanic equivalent, and it's Old English, and as you might expect, of the heath. when I'm talking to people, if I remind them of this, then it's very clear that we're talking about people of the earth. We're talking about people who are connected to the land, and we talk about being connected to our land spirits or spirits of the land. Now, during and after the Middle Ages, the term paganism was often applied to any non-Christian religion, and the term presumed a belief in false gods. The current definition is changed to a more broader definition, a religion other than one of the main world religions, specifically a non-Christian or pre-Christian religion. For example, in the text, converts from paganism to Christianity. So there are the definitions as we see them today, although, as I say, what happens, of course, is many people, when they hear the word paganism, still revert back to the Christian definition of it being somebody who's barbaric or ungodly. Why? One of the reasons that the P word became so infamous is due to a couple of events. I'm going to bring these in because many people have not or are not familiar with these terms, especially the term, the doctrine of discovery. And the other event, or the other thing that happened, was also the introduction of the Inquisition. Now, the doctrine of discovery, I believe, has everything to do with the development of this definition of the word paganism, and has a lot, of course, also to do with indigenous people and obviously colonialism, which, as you can see from the picture, as people are arriving in the New World, they are arriving as Christians, the Spanish, the Portuguese. And in fact, there were a couple of edicts or papal bulls. The most important was the one issued by, it's really difficult, I can't actually read this because I can see my my picture. I'll just try to find it in my notes. But first of all, let's go to the Inquisition. I've got the Inquisition, and then I've got a bit about the, yeah.
I can read it for you if you want to.
Well, let me follow my notes, because I have got notes, and then I'll be able to come across the quote. But to begin with, the Inquisition. The Inquisition was founded in the late 1490s, and it still exists. The Supreme Sacred Congregation of the Roman and Universal Inquisition still exists, though it changed its name a couple of times. It is currently called the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. The Inquisition was primarily concerned with exposing heretics, but it wouldn't take long before anyone who was against the church would be accused of witchcraft, devil worship, and so on. Here we have a picture of the astronomer Galileo Galilei, who was a Christian, but he was also experimenting, and he was brought before the Holy Office and accused of being a heretic. Pagans as devils of the new religion. Often pagan traditions are called, for example, Wicca is called sometimes the old religion, and sometimes we see that the devils of the new religions are the devils of the old religion. So pagans as devils of the new religion, and witches who, according to Exodus verse 22:18, thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. This phrase, of course, has been so important and has been quoted time and time again. The fact that it was a mistranslation and actually means something like, thou shalt not suffer a poison mixer to live. But unfortunately, thou shalt not suffer a witch to live has remained in everybody's mind. Combined with the expulsion of Jews and Muslims in 1492 in Spain by King Ferdinand II of Aragon and Queen Isabella I of Castile, after they conquered the Nasrid Kingdom of Granada, finally freeing Spain from Muslim rule after nearly 800 years, and several papal bulls later, the fate of non-Christians was sealed. One of the most influential papal bulls was issued by Pope Alexander VI on the 4th of May, 1493, which granted to King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella the west and south of a pole-to-pole line 100 leagues west and south of any islands of the Azores and the Cape Verde Islands. The edicts issued by sitting popes, in particular the papal bull Inter Caetera of 1493, issued by Alexander VI, granted permission to explorers like Christopher Columbus and John Cabot to claim for the Christian ruling monarchs the lands they found. It also implored their expedition crews to convert by force, if necessary, the heathens they encountered, who would then become subject to the will of the church. Their only limitation was that the lands they found could not be claimed by any other than Christian monarchy. So they have these two huge influences on the voyages of discovery, and of course, we would see later, it would include people enslaved during the colonization of Latin America and America and Canada. We would see how particularly the Portuguese, the Dutch, the Spanish, the French to some degree, and of course the British would try to convert many people to Christianity. This is still part of what we sometimes see as the missionary, specifically in Africa, but we'll come to that in a few minutes. Here we have modern examples of discrimination and false accusations. In 2017, I was at an online conference from WHRIN, but there were also United Nations workshops being held concerned about witchcraft and human rights. When we look at modern examples of discrimination, accusations of witchcraft and persecution, the recent research done by the Witchcraft and Human Rights Information Network, WHRIN, and the South Africa Pagan Rights Alliance, SAPRA, it is clear how much of a role the often evangelical church has played in the continuation of the idea that pagans and witches are evil. I'll give some references of their websites also at the end of this talk. Not only are the victims in Africa, but the accusation of witchcraft is also to be found in India, Nepal, and other parts of Indonesia, Borneo, and many other countries. During the COVID pandemic, during the pandemic, we also saw how indigenous people and tribal people are also very much marginalized. Here is a film, I think it was also from about 2017, called African Witchfinder, where the Namibian pastor faces a deadly mix of ancient culture. This is the splurge for the film. This is a film, African Witchfinder, and describes how in Namibia, though a woman was found chained, absolutely chained, and she was accused of many things, including witchcraft, but she actually was suffering from dementia. And in Namibia, even today, many people suffering from dementia are seen as being possessed by devils and are accused of witchcraft. So that this is something which is still happening. And of course, the pandemic exacerbated the situation even more. In fact, many people have been accused of being or bringing the virus. Many indigenous people have also been accused of bringing the disease, when ironically, of course, as we go back to the doctrine of discovery, it was actually the Europeans, the Spanish and the British, who brought disease to Latin America and Mexico. Here we see local deities being called upon. This is in India, and what we saw happening in India, where there are still many tribal, what I call the scheduled tribal people, but also in Nepal, they would turn to their local deities when their own health systems are failing. Of course, the poor people, indigenous people, are the ones who are going to be marginalized, as I said, because sometimes they're even accused of causing the disease. However, the United Nations too realized that COVID-19 was affecting many indigenous people, but also wherein WHRIN and SAPRA were still busy working on how to help and support and protect the people who are still being accused of witchcraft. But here we see the United Nations urging member states and the international community to include the specific needs and priorities in addressing the global outbreak of COVID-19. So you've got two things happening here. You've got, on the one hand, already for quite a few years, many people being accused of witchcraft and various other demonic practices, and then along comes COVID. So these two aspects have really presented a huge dilemma and horrendous situation for people of the earth. One of the things that came from the WHRIN research, there was a glimmer of hope, because after 6 years of intensive advocacy by a coalition of survivors, NGOs, academics, and lawyers, the United Nations Human Rights Council has passed a groundbreaking resolution which emphatically condemns harmful practices related to accusations of witchcraft and ritual attacks that results in human rights violations. I have got quite a lot of information on that UN resolution, if anybody's interested. It's an important milestone, because the United Nations was also realizing that the definitions of paganism and what we understand as being paganism in the West differs radically from how paganism is defined in African countries and beyond. So July 27th, 2021, Gary Foxroth from WHRIN was extremely happy to announce, today I bring you great news of hope and celebration, as 5 years after WHRIN and our amazing network members first started working to bring this about, the United Nations Human Rights Council this month passed the first ever resolution on harmful practices, accusations of witchcraft and ritual attacks. I'm going to carry on a little bit quicker because I'm wary of the time. Oh my goodness, I'm already over. Anyway, so here we see the image of, there were also repercussions in the United Kingdom when we've actually seen in recent years, they had this satanic ritual abuse in the 90s, but in recent years, we're now seeing there is also ritual abuse based on again, these accusations of witchcraft, which have been happening in Africa, but it's also spilled over into the African population or people from the Caribbean. You can see how in England it's had huge repercussions. and there have been several cases. As somebody said, we're quite happy to talk about what is inappropriate belief when it comes to terrorism or pedophilia, said African studies expert Dr. Richard Hoskins. But when it comes to fundamentalist religious belief affecting child protection, we don't seem to want to talk about it. So this is we're looking now here at not just the effects of people in Africa or Nepal, or this is also affecting people in England, specifically in the London area. There have been a number of cases. There is also an association called Africans Unite Against Child Abuse, AFRUCA, and Debbie Ario was talking about what she calls rogue churches. She said, in a belief in witchcraft in the UK was endorsed by various African churches putting children at risk. If you look at how fast new African churches have grown here since 2005, it's quite astonishing, she said. One of the key beliefs of these churches is in witches and exorcising them. She said AFRUCA had worked with dozens of churches to improve their policies and practices, but we have churches who preach witchcraft, and this can lead to inciting people to harm children. Dozens of rogue churches don't want to change their practices. Small churches can be hidden away in a living room or a garage. The Metropolitan Police in London actually noted also a rise in crimes which could be attributed to belief or faith-based abuse. There is a project called Project Violet, and on the internet you can actually read a little bit more about what the police in the United Kingdom are doing. They actually on their site they say there are a number of laws in the UK that allow the prosecution of those responsible for abuse linked to faith or belief. One of the biggest challenges is raising awareness and encouraging victims and witnesses to come forward. There's quite a lot of I'll have more about that, but I'm going to skip now to misappropriation of symbols, because this is of course very much linked in to what we've been talking about. The misappropriation of symbols, we can see that today they are used inappropriately, for example, with tattoo designs inspired by ancient tribal images. I also saw very, very recently a play group, an American play group, actually using the Kabbalistic tree of life for mundane activities. They thought it was a nice, fun picture. Of course, the most well-defined misappropriation of symbols, of course, is the swastika. Recently, there was a BBC program on Radio 4 called Reclaiming the Swastika. I'll put the link to that also in the chat later. It's again important to see that many people are using these symbols quite inappropriately, and sometimes they use them actually very, very directly, and as I say, using the tree of life in a mundane activities. Probably people just don't know what these symbols are, but of course some of the symbols are used very definitely to incite hate. I found a very recent example of this when there was an article when Dwayne Johnson was I can see where it's the fake news. The fake news was Alabama attempts to ban Hinduism for idolizing Dwayne Johnson. And there was a picture which had actually been made of a picture of Dwayne Johnson incorporating a very famous Hindu symbol and superimposed on his T-shirt. And then they claimed that people were actually idolizing him or actually saying that Hindus were idolizing Dwayne Johnson, and there he is with his t-shirt. The real news was Alabama overturns decades-old ban on yoga in schools. So from Alabama attempts to ban Hinduism for idolizing Dwayne Johnson, the real news is Alabama overturns decades of an old ban on yoga in schools. Again, we know how things can be tampered with images today. Fake news is also includes alteration of people's speech. We've seen many examples of it, although I should say this is nothing new. Also, propaganda, the Second World War was full of propaganda, but also has been used many times. Of course, we know advertising techniques, how many of these techniques can be used to influence people subliminally. So these are my references. I'd just like to give you a little tip of the iceberg of what many people have to face with today. And this is specifically about the pagan, heathen, people of the earth, indigenous population. And many of the things can, of course, be related also to other religions. But today, as Luke was saying, I've concentrated on basically pagan. So here are the references. I'll stop sharing screens now and open the floor for questions, and I'll post some of these links in the chat. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Morgana. And now if you want to say something or to ask a question, please try to raise your hand.
I can hear somebody speaking. Is Luke speaking?
Yes. Can you hear me well, or is there a problem?
I can hardly hear you, Luke.
Oh.
No, we don't get it either.
Okay, just
okay. So
you're closer to your mic, maybe.
Maybe switch the mic on.
Okay. Well, I'm not sure what Luke. Probably he's asking if anybody's got any questions. Well, I was always asking if anybody's got any questions.
Is it better now?
Yes. Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
I see. For some reason, Zoom decided to decrease the volume of my microphone. Perhaps he thinks I have nothing of import to say. So thank you very much, Morgana, and indeed, we welcome your questions and observations. Please try to raise your hand. I see Jay. Please give me a second to remove the spotlight from Morgana. And Jay, please.
Yeah, Jay's got a question.
Jay, you have to unmute yourself.
Yes,
now
I'm unmuted. Thank you. I wondered whether you are bothered by some modern day traditions using symbols or poetry or rituals from the pagan tradition in ways that you find inappropriate. So, sometimes with the best of intentions and even appreciating, but using it without fully understanding how those symbols and rituals are understood within the pagan tradition. I'm a retired Unitarian Universalist minister in the United States, and we have many pagan identified members within our churches, but sometimes we are concerned that people who don't identify with pagans nevertheless do use those symbols and rituals in ways that involve misunderstanding. What kinds of problems of this kind do you see?
Huge problems, Jay. That would take about a week. It's one of the biggest problems we have. It's one of the biggest problems I've actually had. I come from my tradition is Wicca, and I'm going to include in the links, I'm going to also point you to a documentary about Gerald Gardner to give you a little bit more information about where Wicca comes from. The problem is that in about the 1950s, so the witchcraft laws were revoked, and Gerald Gardner was able to bring a little bit more about his own witchcraft practices into visibility. This kind of led to a huge revival of paganism and really footed the neo-pagan revival. And what I mean by that is, of course, the awakening of the fact that there are many gods and goddesses in Europe, and also led to a huge revival amongst other pagan traditions. Along with that, of course, there was also the goddess movement in America, goddess spirituality, also linked with the gay rights, and many other things contributed to a huge opening and awakening of the divine feminine. And this is perhaps the clue, the divine feminine. And what we saw happening was that there was also a recognition that many of the Native Americans, the indigenous people, also used various rituals where not only the Mother Earth was being revered, but also men and women, and many rituals were being seen as being a link to our greater understanding and reverence for Earth. So we had a huge mushrooming of pagan groups, witch groups, goddess spirituality, shamanism, neo-shamanism. We shouldn't forget neo-shamanism. And this led to practices which would be adopted and in some cases also misappropriated. So what happened when the Pagan Federation was established, this is one of the things that we are already trying to put straight. So anti-defamation, when there were practices or particular things happening, we would try to automatically give right information. And what I also saw was, as people saw particular practices, for example, the sweat lodge. The sweat lodge is perhaps one of the best examples, that people would even start earning money because they would have workshops with, and many of these practices were also being used commercially. Wicca also suffered from, again, people being trained, the schools of Wicca and all the rest of it. And you saw gradually how people were also incorporating breathing techniques, chakras, and many other symbols and methods. And also I saw people taking on symbols and practices, and I think the practices are even more problematic than the symbols, because some of those practices were not being done correctly. I would have to think about some of the voodoo rituals, Santeria, Candomblé, when people went into trance. So I think it's a huge problem, and we still have I think as a pagan community, and I'm still trying to do my best to give people correct information. As I say, it's one of those things that is part of, unfortunately, a commercial platform, if you like, because it sells. And how do you prevent people from selling weekend retreats, coming to my sweat lodge, or coming to my ayahuasca ritual, and people are dying. Some of the people have been, I think it's very problematic. So I always say to people, don't ever use anything unless you understand where it's coming from. And of course, this is an ongoing thing. But as things become hazy, it's very difficult. It's very difficult. Where is the fivefold star or the pentagram? We call it the witch's knot or the witch's foot, because it's a very old symbol. We see in numerology how much of this information, and again, looking at the Kabbalistic system, any of the esoteric systems where numerology is concerned, so many of the symbols are, people can actually get lots and lots of information, but generally people don't. They just, go to Google and just Google it, and I'm just happy, you know, when they find something that fits in with their world. So I think it's extremely problematic. It is extremely problematic, and I think all of us need to be aware of. And we saw again the 6th of January, you know, where symbols are being used and are not even people, you know, are not even aware of where they're coming from. So I do think it is very, very problematic. That's why I wanted to get this out, because it's not something that's new, but I think what's happening is it's accelerating, because the world is much smaller, and because of the techniques of you know, photoshopping and memes and all, and certainly social media, certainly things like TikTok, Facebook, who are just there for a quick shot, then many of these systems are being really, really wrongly presented. So I do think it's absolutely problematic. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jay and Morgana. Wolfgang, you wanted to say something.
Yeah, thank you very much for the speech. And honestly, I personally don't know too much about pagans. You know? The first time I heard was by UUA. I heard there's a pagans group in the UUA, and as we are here in IARF, I would like to know in general, how is your own organization? How do you have your meetings? Do you have services? For example, when you are in the UUA, do you have services together with these UUA groups? And how is your cooperation with other, as you are an IARF, with other religions in general? Yeah? But I would like to a little bit more about your organization, as I have at the moment, I have no idea how it works. I heard a lot of signs and so, but I cannot put that all together at the moment. Yeah.
Sorry, what's the abbreviation? UUA?
Of the UUA, Unitarian and Universalist Association. Yeah. So first, this is in the United States. Well, maybe somebody else who is Jay is here, who knows more about UUA as me. As he is part of the. Well, this is a very important Unitarian organization. You know, it's about 180,000 people organized there. And well, you are part of this organization. There's a Pagans group, and I want to know, maybe you tell a little bit about your organization and how you cooperate in general with other religions. Or do you call yourself a religion?
Is there somebody from UUA? I know it is Universalist. Jay, can you
I can say something about in the United States and North America has been increasingly, many members have identified themselves with the pagan tradition, or sometimes called the earth-centered traditions. And of course, and many of our congregations have celebrations at the 4 points of the calendar year, the solstice and the equinox celebrations, which come from pagan traditions. And of course, even the Christmas tree, despite its name, it comes from Northern European pagan traditions. So these ideas are woven into our annual celebrations in a lot of ways, and maybe in some inappropriate ways. That's not for me to say.
Yeah, I know a lot of my American friends are also Wicca and pagan. So, but I was wondering from your point of view. I know many of my friends that love going to the UUA because it's very akin to like the Quakers, meeting friends, and so I do know it's very popular. As if any of them, I think as well in I have friends in England. I think there's one of the UU in Oxford, and it's always seen as being much more open and would accept things like what we've seen happening also in the UK, the Forest Church. So people would celebrate, as Jay was just pointing out, the major 8 festivals of the year, the 4 solar festivals, and then what we have the other 4, what we call the cross-quarter days, which is still very ancient actually. But those are the cross-quarter days which have a much greater connection with the agricultural cycle. So we've just had Samhain, for example, 31st of October. The next big one will of course be Imbolc, which is the 1st of February. Then we have, of course, our favorite Beltane, 1st of May. And then the last one, of course, is Lammas, which is the real harvest festival. So a lot of, I know a lot of people, and what we actually see happening is many of the Christian communities have actually adopted what we call Wiccanate, because it was the Wicca groups from Gerald Gardner who actually ritualized and made a very working model. So if anybody talks about having rituals celebrating the 8 festivals of the year, they celebrate in a circle and they acknowledge a god and goddess or a polytheistic head, godhead, then often it can be traced back to practices of Gerald Gardner and the Wicca movement. So that's why I said in the neo-pagan movement, so much goes back to what Gerald Gardner did and how, especially in England, people got together and started realizing that the divine feminine had not been revered for a long time. So I think that's where many Christians, and especially in England as well, will definitely work with us, because we know how to do rituals. Anybody else got any questions? I haven't talked much about the situation in the Netherlands. One of the things that people say, they have this big thing about, is Wicca a religion? And I often say, well, within paganism, we talk about nature religions. And the immediate question is, well, are they recognized? Are they recognized? And I said, well, one of the problems is that, well, it's not a problem, but in the Netherlands, no religion is recognized in those terms, because the First Amendment of the Constitution guarantees everybody has the right to believe and practice. They have the freedom of worship. So in the UK, that's slightly different. So when we look at the laws of the land, then how, for example, people are discriminated, it depends on where you live. You can be discriminated for your religious thoughts and beliefs simply because it's not allowed. For example, being an atheist in Saudi Arabia or in Egypt at the moment is really problematic. You can't be a non-believer, you have to believe. When I say, well, I come from a Wicca background, and apparently I don't have a faith because I don't have a holy book. Where does that put us? So it's very often a question of definitions. It's definitions, and sometimes I find it handier to say that I'm with a group of people who see themselves as being people of the earth. Certainly within the interfaith arena, it's a lot easier to, instead of getting into all the problems of pagans and witches, you're all devil worshippers, which has happened even in the Netherlands. I mean, even in the Netherlands, it happens regularly, that we're being accused because we have no faith, that we must be devilish. So this was the nice thing about the conference we had in May, because we saw from different religions how some people see that sometimes the religions themselves can be very constraining, with their own doctrination or doctrines. So I think one of the things that's happening now is that people are becoming a little bit more open to different faiths, but what constitutes a faith, what constitutes a religion. So I think many of us are beginning to readdress particular terms. So I think all of us have to start thinking of what does it actually mean, and what happens when people within Christianity, for example, start doing rituals in the wood, and instead of having statues of the god and goddess, have a statue of Maria and Jesus. You know, it's one of those things you see also happening. For example, in Utrecht at the moment, there is an exhibition about Maria Magdalena, and you see there a very typical example of how history is being reassessed, and people having looked, and specifically at those saints or those people who have been vilified in the past. They're now being, their situation is now being readdressed. So if you want an example of how people are trying to reconcile these insights to hatred or discrimination, certainly looking at the question of Maria Magdalena is also an extremely important example at the moment. How does anybody else when you hear of pagans attending, how do you normally react? Anybody?
Sorry, Morgana, but Jarek has had his hand raised for quite some time. Maybe we can allow a question from him. Maybe he will address this very issue.
Oh, I thought I was answering his question. Sorry, about the Universalist Church. Sorry.
No problem. Jarek, please.
Thank you. Am I on mute now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you. There is in Europe also a living continuity in the pagan tradition, for example, in eastern parts of Europe. If you look behind me, there is a towel from Ukraine with solar symbols on it.
Yeah.
And the towel was used in the Christian church. And some weeks ago, I got this from my Latvian friend. That's a Ugunskrusts, a cross of fire. And I used it even a week ago when I was preaching in the Unitarian Church in Ireland. And what's interesting to me, is there any connection, is there any link between the West European pagan groups and the people from Eastern Europe, from Ukraine, from Belarus, from Poland, eastern part of Poland, from Baltic countries, where that pagan tradition is still alive and has been alive for centuries? And maybe could IARF play a role as in connection making between those groups?
Yeah. Some years ago, I wrote an article called Paganism as a Cultural Phenomena. And I actually explained how the rise of the goddess spirituality Wicca and the rise of neo-paganism in the West also influenced the, again, revival of pagan groups, especially in the Slavic countries. Now, I'm not just talking about Asatru, the Icelandic, Norse, because Norse mythology has always been very popular. Mm-hmm. But what we actually saw happening was the rise again of Slavic paganism. And what I actually saw as well, that when we talk about paganism as a cultural phenomena, then you can actually start seeing how symbols, cultural practices you can talk about them much more easily for a start, because then you can put them in a context. So when we talked about, for example, the rise of communism, that many of the pagan practices and pagan symbols, which had actually been incorporated into the church, had to be, pushed aside because communism wouldn't allow, and many of the shamans had to sort of bury all their ritual statues and garments and many other things. So what's happened again with the revival, post-communist period, countries like Poland, certainly Ukraine, Russia, have again explored their own pagan histories and started again to be much more visible. The only problematic thing there is the misappropriation of symbols, and of course I'm going to move towards the misappropriation of symbols and the rise of neo-fascist groups using pagan symbols. And that was one of the biggest problems we've had with pagan as a true groups, Viking groups, Germanic groups, that often they would use those symbols again for violence and demonstrations, what have you. So again, I have some friends also in America who've been looking at the situation with pagan symbols and how they've been incorporated into the church. And many of the rituals in the church, the Orthodox Church in Bulgaria, for example, have many symbols. You only have to look at, and also in Poland, the Maritza, the Drown and the Morgana. Many of the practices are beautiful. The part of the Slavic culture, the dance, the music, the Bulgarian women's mystery. So there's lots and lots of things. But again, one of the things we've been really aware of is the misappropriation, and that's certainly happened within the Rodnovera groups. There is certain groups also in Russia, of course, who are not particularly that they, again, you have the Baltic warriors, you know, they're there, and we have this phenomenon what we call blood and heritage, where people will, you know, put a little bit of soil in their flags and then go to sleep in it, you know. So there are two sides to this story, of course, and again, I think it's important that we understand where both streams are coming from. What you often see as well in the neo-pagan groups in what I say the East, to differentiate it from the West, is male leadership. In the West, we've had this huge emphasis on the divine feminine. So in the West, you see that paganism has a more of a tendency to bring in the goddess into the picture, whereas what we've seen in neo-pagan groups in Russia and elsewhere actually put a great emphasis on male leadership. So again, the women have had to really fight, and I know certainly Remover in Lithuania have had to really fight for female leadership. And when Jonas Trinkinus died, Ina Trinkinus, who was the clan mother, had a huge problem of actually asserting her role as being the leader of Remover. So again, it's a very actual subject, yeah. So you will recognize many things from Poland, Slavic paganism being incorporated in many of our practices as well.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Morgana. Wicka, yes.
You muted, Wicka.
No, I had a very elaborate question that I don't think we have the time for. I would just instead use my time to give you a very small piece of information about not appropriation of symbols, but just symbolism, pagan symbolism continuing in the Christian church. Most of you will have visited Amsterdam at some point, and you'll remember the huge cathedral, or now Protestant church, near to the Anne Frank house, which is called the Westerkerk. Now, a great-grandfather of mine was an elder there, and when he passed away, his coffin got carried anti-clockwise round that Westerkerk, which was quite a procession, I guess, quite a long way to walk as well. Well, this is a curiosity of my family, but that must have been a very ancient custom in the heart of our first republic, you know, carried on through the ages. It was not new. So you can imagine. Yeah. Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Witzka, very much. We have a question from Emmanuel from India. He wrote it in the chat.
I was just,
Yeah, of course. Please go on. Please go on.
Message for Emmanuel. I'm just putting the PFI website for more information. Hang on, just let me finish it and then I can. Right, there we go. So if everybody's interested in the major tenets of paganism, the major groups, the PFI website has separate sections, and the Dutch we have our own, obviously our own website in Dutch. But the main beliefs in paganism are, the main belief is our reverence for earth. That is the core. That is the core of most people who are connected with nature religions. If you say, what is our major interest? What is our major task? What is our major activity? It's always connected to reverence for the earth. So whether we do it with the, if you remember that, then you're on your way. If anybody wants to practice rituals or follow the moon cycle, the seasonal cycle, the solar cycle, but is definitely connected to this idea of reverence for the earth, then you're a pagan at heart, because you're connected, again, pagan of the land. So the main beliefs are anything where we are seen to be practicing reverence for the earth. Also means being guardians, stewards of the earth. So one of our major connections are, of course, the ecological movement. So if you say, what are the beliefs of paganism? We then will say the protection of the earth. We as guardians of the earth. So those are the main beliefs behind paganism.
If I may, Morgana, if you could elaborate a little bit about on what the earth means to pagans. So when you say earth, what do you have in mind? Is it, I imagine it's not only our modern view of the ecosystem, it's something maybe that goes deeper, and a web of connections, something spiritual. How would you elaborate on the earth as understood by, experienced by pagans?
Yeah, well, as I say, people fall into the trap by saying we are part of earth, or we are part of nature. And I try to say to people, actually, we are nature. We're also human nature with all its failings and its qualities and all the rest of it. One of the problems in the West has been our disassociation, our disconnectedness with the earth. Now, whether it's because the religions have taught us to go and pray in churches or buildings and disregard the earth, I'm going to leave that in the middle. But what we've seen happening, even from a social point of view, with the rise of industrialism, the rise of what we call the logos, Rudolf Steiner has written a great deal about this. The more we become involved with our cities, the material, we go beyond the material, and then we forget the spiritual side of our existence. And that has led to a huge disconnection with nature. So instead of adapting to nature as animals do and plants do, what we do, of course, is try to figure out how we can beat nature. And what I mean by that is, for example, in the winter time, instead of putting on, when it gets cold, an extra sweater, we'll just turn up the central heating. So it's this lack of connectedness that has led to so many people becoming disenfranchised and having no respect whatsoever. And the doctrine of discovery, I'm afraid, has also, was a way, the nail that was hit into the coffin, when it was man shall have dominion over the earth. man, not woman, man. And it's these kind of quotes, and I think, oh my goodness, if you're brought up thinking that man has dominion over the earth, how on earth can you have any respect for the earth whatsoever? And I think there is a lot of reconciliation that needs to be done. But the first thing I always feel is we have to, in our own hearts, realize that we are the earth, we are nature. And maybe we'll go into a lot of denial. But as soon as you understand that, and I always say to people, if you want to start practicing, just go and follow the moon. You know, there it is every day. You see it, well, if it's not too cloudy. But when you start connecting with the moon cycle, and we know that the moon cycle has such an influence on water, the floods, the ebb and tides of the oceans, the seas, how much of an influence does the moon have on our own water? We're, you know, like 75% water. So when people start realizing, oh my God, yeah, of course the moon influences it. It's not a myth. It's not something made up. It's not a story, although we have lots of stories about the moon. It's also been scientifically proved that the moon has a huge gravitational pull on water. And at that point, you know, I can say that that's not a belief. We know, and many people in Wicca, in paganism, it says we don't believe, we know. And the more we know, the greater an understanding we have of the earth. So I mean, that may be a bit of a long-winded answer, but for many people, it's so obvious. It's right in front of you. It's right in front of you. But often what we see is the most obvious is the things that we don't actually see. So why it's important that we become aware is really the key. The key is becoming aware of those things which are around us every single day, every single minute, and those forces of nature which have a hugely effect on us.
Thank you very much, Morgana, for this very eloquent response. We still have time for some questions. Carola wants you to recommend her a good book that would elaborate on the historical context and pagan beliefs, and I'm sure you have plenty of books and materials to recommend, some of which you've probably written yourself and are to be found on your website, as well as the Pagan Federation's website. But do we have another question? Is there someone who'd like to say something?
I'll answer Carola's question very, very
Of
quickly.
course.
One of the most important people at the moment who are the historian, of course, is Ronald Hutton. Not everybody agrees with Ronald Hutton, but he's written several books. Triumph of the Moon is probably the most famous, written more than 20 years ago. But he's also written about the pagan traditions in England, of course. But he gives regular talks still. So anything written by Ronald Hutton is a very good place to start. And then, of course, it'll lead to other books. But certainly Ronald Hutton is a good place to start for anybody who's interested in pagan history.
Thank you. So the name is Ronald?
I'll write his name.
If you could write his name, yes. And the book title was The Rise of the Moon. Yeah. Is there someone who'd like to say something or ask a question? You can unmute yourself and speak if you can't find the raise your hands button. So if not, then perhaps I will allow myself to ask another question, something that's always been an important question in my life, in my own, you could say, as religious experience. That is the problem or the issue of the suffering that we encounter in life. It's a huge problem for Christian theology, of course, because when you have an omnipotent, omniscient, good God, then of course it's troublesome when you witness all the suffering in the world. But with the devotion that pagans have to the earth and to nature and to its rhythms, and how, because obviously you cannot ignore the fact that even the animals in their most natural ways of life also endure a lot of suffering, a lot of illness and death and decay. It's something that cannot be helped. How is it incorporated into the pagan experience? What's your attitude to the suffering, to the death that you see about you?
Well, I'd make a distinction between animals and people. I think sometimes we say people are beasts, which I think is a huge insult to the beasts. From a pagan perspective, there are certain things we see as being natural, in the sense that there is a natural order, there is a natural hierarchy within the plants, minerals, and animals. So there are certain processes. For example, is a thunderstorm, is that something that's hateful? A thunderstorm that maybe destroys a lot of things, or is a thunderstorm necessary for the germination of plants? We know that sometimes that certain natural phenomena are actually necessary to create a fertile environment for further growth. So if we look at the whole cycle of life and death, from the plants, from how animals, but also how all of creation has actually evolved, then I think we have a good insight into perhaps the god and goddess's plan. I tend to say, instead of getting too wound up with theosophical or theological questions, because in the end, I've tried this as well. I even got to the point, Luke, when I actually offered or proffered that maybe humans have a hate gen, that there is a gene for hate, but that is very slippery ground, very slippery ground. So, and why I say whisper, because most people will not even enter that discussion, because to actually say that we are hardwired for certain things is difficult to get your head around. On the other hand, maybe these are questions which help us to understand what the evolution of the earth is all about. We have, I remember having these discussions early on, because how do we, within a Wicca context, deal with death? How do we deal with hatred? How do we deal with many things? Again, I can only put it into the larger perspective of the natural cycles. Many of us believe in reincarnation, but again, a lot of us know the things like we have something we call weird, which is W-Y-R-D, and is the root of our English word weird, like, isn't it weird? It actually means to become, means unfolding. And what I often think is, the web of weird, which is, it's again for me like a web and resonates. Every single thought, every single action is recorded, past, present, and future. And we see in the Norse mythology, the Norns and the web of weird. And I often think that if we have a real grasp of what all of our actions, past, present, and future, and how that resonates, then we have a greater understanding of the concept of evil, the concept of good and bad. Now, within a pagan context, I don't actually believe in evil, which may surprise a few people. What I do believe is in right action at the right time. Or if I do something which I perceive as being wrong, it's usually because I've chosen the wrong action at the wrong moment. Now we have this golden rule if it's harm none, do what you will. And that also is a guideline, it's an instruction to say, look at what's happening and minimize any harm, but sometimes you may have to make a decision. So when I look at it from a pagan perspective, when I look at it from the web of weird, the web of life, I have to start saying what is necessary to make or help a process to actually unfold. You know, we cannot have the spring without the winter. We cannot have the summer without the spring. We cannot have the autumn without the summer. As we see the cyclic process, we understand or begin to understand why certain things are necessary, as much as the phases of the moon. You know, the new moon, when the moon is not visible, and then the very beginning, and then, you know, moving towards full moon, the effects. So from the perspective of how do I see life in general, why there is suffering, I think that this is part of our, not part of our own karma, because I don't like to use it part of our own karma, but it's also part of our own biography. It's also part of our own biography, as everything that happens in the evolution of the earth is the biography, the story of the earth, and how we participate in that. We can learn from mythology, we can learn from stories, and as we gradually understand how the earth connects to the cosmos, to the stars, we realize we're not on our own. We can't see ourselves, again, coming back to we are nature. So I don't know if that helps to answer your, I see also always as a philosophical journey, if you like. I'm always thinking, what have I learned? How can I use those examples, for example, in dialogue? How can we've learned how to have different principles of communicating with each other. So learning from our own experience also helps us to communicate with other people. But many of that communication is also in the form of stories. So understanding why there is grief, why there is pain, we often revert also to our stories, and again try to understand why and what is actually happening and learn. Unfortunately, as we've seen time and time again, people are they have very short memories unfortunately, and I think this is the problem, that we still get these things recurring again and again and again, because people are not learning, they're not remembering. So within a pagan context, we try to, via the stories, via our mythology, is actually to remind people. And this is why the indigenous people, their wisdom is so important. Listen to their stories, because they will give us a context in which we can learn to grow and evolve.
Thank you very much, Morgana. Is there anyone who'd like to say something or ask a question? You can just unmute yourself and speak if you want to.
Yes, Morgana, I would have one question, because at the moment I'm feeling really bad because I have a necklace with the tree of life, and the tree of life is really important for me, and it's a wonderful symbol to me. But now I'm really not sure. I'm Unitarian, and I have been thinking, does it offend you if people who are not Wicca or pagan wear that, or what is your attitude towards that?
I'm not offended. I'm not offended easily. I can be disappointed. But if, Heidi, today you say, oh, I'm going to find out more about this tree of life, Morgana has inspired me to go and find out more about the Kabbalistic system, then I would say fantastic, absolutely fantastic. if people use symbols and continually use symbols, then I can be very offended. But even then, we can only hope that we can help people to be educated. We can do that every day. We're always helping, but also educate ourselves. So I hope that those people on the 6th of January in New York, at the Capitol or the White House, or whatever, I can't remember, yeah, the Capitol, God, that they begin to realize, what is the Constitution of America? You know, I immediately went back, and Thanksgiving Day, for example, is a moment to start going back to our basic tenets. You know, these are always opportunities to say, I'm not sure I know what's really going on. So I remember thinking when there was all this hassle about storming the Capitol, and I actually went back to the American Constitution, the right to bear arms and all the rest of it. And it always makes you think, yeah, how would we cope with that in the Netherlands? And what's happening now in the Netherlands? We have rioting, young children, and I say children because they're underage, you know, throwing fireworks at police, throwing stones because they're bored or they're supposed to be against COVID, but it's just crazy. It's just crazy. So I think, again, Heidi, it's important that we continually evolve and try to understand what these symbols are. And if we don't know enough about them, to go and, you know, find out more, like you just said, well, maybe I should go and find out. A world will open for you, as the world opens for me. Every time I see something happening, I think, why are these children so violent? What is it? Our Constitution says freedom of worship, freedom of demonstration, as long as it doesn't impinge the health of the you know, the people. The right of demonstrations, it helps us to go back again and again to say, you know, ponder on these. But I always say, you know, I can only do it from a philosophical point of view, in a way to be able to say for myself, can I live with this? Do I agree with it? But what is my answer? And again, in the Netherlands now, how do we help, you know, everybody to get through this pandemic and understand, when even I'm thinking, I'm getting to a point now where it's just getting too much. Spiritual resilience, how do we, you know, or even theosophical, political resilience, it's so important. But the only thing we can do is, again, quietly sit down and have conversations like this. Why the motivational dialogue is so important, why in the Netherlands URI we have occasional meetings in dialogue. You know, I think we must always keep the dialogue going. It's the only way that we can help people who are feeling angry go back to the roots, appreciative inquiry. Let's put into practice all those things we've learned, and really, you know, take heart that we can, we're not powerless, but we just have to make that effort. And that's all it takes, time. Time is our most precious commodity. And thank you for attending tonight's example and not being out shopping because they're going to be locked out.
We can't. The shops are shut, Morgana.
Exactly.
We're in lockdown.
Yeah.
So, Caroline,
I wanted to ask, I wanted to come in on what Morgana was saying about misappropriation and learning about symbols, because I noticed in 2020, when the whole Black Lives Matter thing, I started diving into why people, I've always been interested, but I looked more into the historical context of it, with the police, how the police force was set up in America, which was a racist institution, why the noose, people were, all these things, they tell a story, and if we would take the time to look into it and to understand, then you can start to understand other people's ideas, other people's stories, how they view these misappropriation of these symbols, especially by far-right groups at the moment. It's really horrific. So I wanted to just validate that point that Morgana made, that these things are set on our path so that we can look at them, and we should look at them and investigate them and find out more about them. There's so much that we can learn now. We're in a fantastic position with the internet that we can look into historical context, we can look up things, we can find out, and we can broaden ourselves and our thinking. Yeah. Got nothing else to do in lockdown. Might as well do that.
Hocus pocus.
Well, let us all hope that the days of the lockdown will be behind us shortly, and it's, you know, the times will return to a semblance of, you know, sanity. But thank you again, Morgana, for this wonderful meeting, for everything you said and showed us, and all the references and hints you gave us as to where we can learn more about paganism and your tradition. And I'm sure that we will meet again in the IARF, with the IARF community, and I hope that the ties between us, the pagan community, the IPF and IARF, will grow stronger. And thank you everyone who came. Indeed, even if you were locked down, you could still open up Netflix or anything. So it still should be appreciated. Thank you. The meeting was recorded, and with Morgana's permission, which she graciously gave us, will be available on YouTube through IARF's website and social media if you want to revisit it or share it with your friends.
Yeah, I was sorry that my Pagan Federation people couldn't make it, because they could give so much more information for, or is he gone? Yeah, a couple of people in England. Robert's in England or not?
Sorry, Robert?
Yes, I am.
Yes, and Derek's in England as well. So, you know, if you want any more information about the survey, get in touch with the Pagan Federation, Sarah and Steffi von Scott is the PF Scotland, and of course we were very, very much there for COP26. So I'd be really interested in to find out how all of you got on with the to the climate summit. So maybe, Luke, maybe an idea for another motivational dialogue is, what is everybody doing for the climate? What does your faith say about climate change?
Yes, it is an important topic, of course, for every human being on the face of the earth, and we already had one dialogue devoted to this with Betsy Dar from our US chapter, who's very much involved in these matters. But of course, the situation is evolving, and you can't possibly cover everything with one meeting. So if you have someone who can share something important and, you know, inspiring about it, then please do let us know. Yes, Carola?
Roll your hand still up. And please feel welcome to join us on Facebook with URI Netherlands, but also URI Environmental Network. You're all invited to join us on the Environmental Network and the URI Global Network as well. We're doing a lot of sharing of stories on the both on the Global and Environmental Network. We see it as being the living environment these days. And of course, that is also concerned with human rights, anything from gender equality to LGBT questions and all the rest of it. The living environment is so important, And let's pray for all of us that we are safe, but also pray for all those who are still, suffering so much from this awful, awful pandemic. Again, the indigenous people and marginalized people are the ones who've suffered the most. Lack of income, but people are just so horrible. You know, blaming them for this awful virus. So I would ask you all, you know, if you have a moment or coming up to Christmas, if you want to make donations to any of the individual financial help. And again, you know, feel very welcome to check out URI. And we're doing quite a few things. So it'd be great to see you all live. I hope to see Vitska, of course, live again. But it's nice to see Esther again. How are you getting on in Germany? Are you okay?
Esther, please unmute yourself if you want to speak.
Yes, I live in Switzerland, not in Germany.
I thought
and you know, we have a liberal tradition. Also, it is not as strong sometimes as I would like, but it means that everybody has to decide her or himself whether to have a vaccine or not.
Yeah.
So of course you can imagine how a polarization also comes up, but we always speak about it, and so I think until now, it's quite remained enough liberal.
Fantastic, yeah. Anyway, thanks again for everybody. I mean, I love these conversations, and let's keep them going. And hopefully we will see each other in real life in the next year or so. It's been fabulous. Thanks again, Luke, for all your help as well. It's been brilliant.
Thank you very much, Morgana. Thank you, everyone, and have a good evening and a good week.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Yeah. You too. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.